Hello, welcome back to my channel and my semi-regular roundup of my recent film discoveries, old vintage movies that I've seen for the first time. Now, last time I spoke to you, I was making my way through this beast, Masaaki Kobayashi's The Human Condition, a 9-hour Japanese masterpiece. Now, Kobayashi is perhaps best known for Kwaidan, his portmanteau horror film, beautiful series of ghost stories, or his excellent samurai films from the 60s, Harakiri and Samurai Rebellion, I think two of the best samurai movies ever made. But he's also in Japan known for this film, a 9-hour epic on the Japanese experience in the Second World War. Now, in this film, we find Kobayashi in less experimental form. It's more David Lean style filmmaking, this. It's more of a grand statement film rather than an experimental film. But it's well worth watching because it's fascinating to me to watch a movie about the Second World War from a Japanese perspective. So seldom see that. And it's really interesting because there's three films that make up the trilogy, obviously. The first one is set in China, in Manchuria, Japanese-occupied Manchuria. And the main character, he's an idealistic guy who is employed as the head of works in a mine out in the middle of nowhere, which is employing slave labour made up of prisoners of war from the Chinese army, right? And it's interesting to watch this. Some of you will have seen that I did a video on Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, right? Which is about the Hoss family, the commandant's family of Auschwitz, trying to live a normal life outside Auschwitz camp. This is an interesting counterpoint to watch, because the first film, he goes with his wife to this place, and she tries to build a home and have a nice life, but he is tormented by the tortures undergone by these Chinese prisoners of war just over, the fence. And he tries to help them. But actually, in trying to help them, both sides come to distrust him and it all falls apart. So eventually he finds himself conscripted to the army. He falls foul of the officials and they put him in the army. The second film is about him training in the army, again falling foul of the officers, and his first experience of combat. And the third film is the Japanese army has been effectively routed and they're all trying to get home. It's the Great Retreat, and it's about him, trekking across China, trying to get back to Japan. It's an incredibly bleak, grueling, harrowing film. It's not a fun movie. It's not a barrel of laughs, but it is a brilliant, sustained piece of work. And I'm really glad that I watched it. It gave me a fantastic insight into the Japanese war experience. Really superb. Some other Japanese classics that I've caught up on. As you'll know, I've done a whole series on Japanese cinema. I'm a great Japanese cinema devotee, but I'm always tripping over masterpieces. And there are some really important Japanese films that I've had to catch up on. This is one of them, Pale Flower. I never got round to watching this. It's by a very significant new wave director called Shinoda. Now, in the past, I've not much cared for Shinoda, but this was the film that made him famous, and by God, it's good. On the surface, it appears to be quite a straightforward Yakuza film, right? So it's about this gangster. He's been in prison. He took the rap for some crime. He's come back out, and he goes back to these gambling dens that he used to help run. And he becomes obsessed, he becomes infatuated with this mysterious woman who seems addicted to the gambling dens. They start this rather dangerous relationship that might unravel his place in Yakuza society. And it all ends in this rather baroque assassination, almost kind of Wellesian assassination scene. I thought this film was absolutely incredible. Brilliant, melange of, editing, brilliant cinematography, brilliant use of composition, and a really, fast-paced, brilliantly told story. I can't recommend it highly enough. Pale Flower, it's really, really good. Two other more obscure Japanese films. I'm really obsessed with the director Toshio Matsumoto, another major figure in the Japanese New Wave. Now, Matsumoto is best known for his first film. He only made 4 feature films. His first film is called Funeral Parade of Roses. It came out in the late 60s. And it's a portrait of the world of the hostess bar in the gay area of Tokyo. And it's an amazing hand grenade of a film. A brilliant experimental psychedelic, shitstorm of a movie. It's absolutely incredible. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's just so invigorating and fascinating to watch. He followed it up 3 years later with a film called Shura, sometimes known as Demons, sometimes known as Pandemonium. This is one of my favourite movies of all time. It's quite difficult to get hold of, but if you can, it is a masterpiece. And what it is, it's a jidaigeki, it's a samurai film. But it's a samurai film filmed like a film noir. In fact, I'd go further. It's almost like a David Lynch movie. It's like an endless nightmare. Like it's all set at night. And it's a revenge drama, a very violent revenge drama, where all the deaths are done in this kind of incredible slow motion with disconnected sound. And you get this really intense sense of living through a nightmare. Certain actions are repeated on screen for no apparent reason. There's this wonderful shot you see of men running after the main protagonist in the night with their little lanterns going up and down. It's almost like a sort of shadow play with puppets. It really gets to you. It's an amazing film. But the second 2 films that Matsumoto made are not as well known. His 4th film that he made in the 80s, Dogra Magra, has just been released on Blu-ray in the UK. I have to say it's my least favourite of the 4 films. It's an intriguing film, it's worth watching. It's about a guy who wakes up in a lunatic asylum and he doesn't know how he's got there. And with the doctors, he starts to piece it together. But you start to realise that he is genuinely insane. So that you're never sure that what you're watching is either memory, dream, madness, whatever. It's hard work. I admire its bravery. It's not the easiest film to like, but do try it. It's come out on Blu-ray in Britain. But the 3rd film that Matsumoto made has been almost completely ignored. It's often called The War of the 16-Year-Olds. A better translation of the title is War at the Age of 16, because that's what it's really about. It starts off with this sort of young drifter, kind of 70s, Age of Aquarius type. And he seems to be drifting, but at the same time he seems to be drifting with a purpose back to his home village. And there he hooks up with a young 16-year-old girl, and they start a sort of slightly illicit relationship. He ends up staying at her house with her family, this middle-class family, and they're a family of secrets. Upstairs there's this mad uncle who had some kind of experience in the war that's driven him insane. And that's what the film's about. It's about Japan's shame, its war guilt, and the way that that still percolates through relationships in the modern day. I've heard it said that this is Matsumoto's most conventional film, but it is not a conventional film. It's a very intense film, and it has all that same fascination with hysteria and quasi-madness that you find in Matsumoto's other 3 features. It's an analogy for... what is happening here is that it's called War at the Age of 16 because this girl at the age of 16 is at war with her parents and at war with society. But then you go back, you flip back to her mother at the age of 16 and what she had to go through in the Second World War as a 16-year-old, and the 2 things are counterpointed. That's why it's called War at the Age of 16. The way it deals with the war guilt is a little bit heavy-handed towards the end, but overall I think it's a fascinating film, and I love the texture of it, the sort of intense spikiness of it all the way through. Finally, from Japanese cinema, I absolutely love the director Yuzo Kawashima. I'm more and more convinced he's one of the great directors. Kawashima is a bridge between the sort of classic cinema from the 1950s into the new wave cinema. And he was a director who was obsessed with the lower order. People on the breadline, people trying to make do, And he makes almost play-like films that are often black comedies. And I think he's a really fantastic director. I caught up with 2 of his films recently. Suzaki Paradise Red Light District, Great title for a film, and apparently this was his personal favourite. And Our Town. Suzaki Paradise is a very cheap, very simple film. It's about a couple who've hit hard times, and she decides that she wants to take up her old job of being a bar hostess, flirting with customers in a bar. He doesn't particularly like this, and he has to end up being a delivery driver, and there's a tension between them. And all the time, the whole film is set right on the outskirts of the red light district. So there's a simple metaphor that they're on the edge of a cliff, and if they don't work it out, they'll fall off the cliff into the red light district, right? So a very simple film, very cheap, often just in 2 or 3 locations or standing sets. I think it's outstanding. I think the work with the actors, the integrity of the script writing, beautiful piece of work. Our Town is really interesting. It starts off like in the Japanese colonies in the early 20th century when Japan had an empire across Southeast Asia, and it's in the Philippines. And it gives this historical lecture about this road that was built by Japanese workers across the Philippines, and people died making this road, appalling conditions. And the story follows one guy, a foreman, who helped work on this road. And he returns to Japan. He thinks he's a hero. No one really cares who he is. He's just a nobody, right? But he carries this feeling that he's a hero who helped in the Philippines. The whole film is a black comedy. He tries to get back in with the woman he left. He tries to become a father to the child he abandoned, this daughter who's never known him or seen him. And it follows him through the years. And basically, because of his attitudes, he inadvertently ruins the lives of everyone he's close to. It's obviously an analogy for how, patriarchal, militaristic Japan inadvertently ruined the lives of its people. I thought it was a great film. Sly, intelligent, comic, and to the point. And I think it's worth checking out if you can find it. Outside of Japanese cinema, the major discovery I've made in the last few months is a film I've been looking for years. And I found it on a website that I know I've plugged many times before, and I'm not going to stop plugging it. I'm going to keep going. You're just going to have to put up with it. Rarefilms.com, films with 2 M's. An amazing resource. And the film is Pirosmani. I've always loved films about painters and about the creation of works of art, and this is one of the best I've ever seen. It's about a painter, a Georgian painter from the country of Georgia, and it's directed by Georgi Shengelia. He was a local painter. He just started painting local pubs and farms and farm animals. He had a very primitivist, very simple style, completely uneducated style. And he slowly grew fame because people started putting their paintings up in their pubs and their restaurants. Though he spent most of his life in poverty, sneered at by the critics. What's distinctive about this film is that the filmmakers, the director and his cinematographer, have gone to some lengths to try and reproduce the look of his paintings in the cinematography and in the production design. And it is an extraordinarily beautiful film. The lighting, the composition, the colour is gorgeous. Now this Rare Films site, right, what it does is it pulls films that have been released on YouTube and it's put English subtitles on them and made them available, right? Even on YouTube quality, this film is dazzlingly beautiful. I can't wait for it to come out on Blu-ray or 4K. It's absolutely stunning. The next film I want to talk about is Taxi Tehran. Now, this was made by the director Jafar Panahi. Jafar Panahi was a significant figure in the Iranian cinema of the 1990s, which I was heavily into. That was a huge part of how I got into cinema, along with Kiarostami and Mohsen Makhmalbaf. But Panahi, it's not that he's been forgotten, but what happened with Panahi was he was an assistant to Kiarostami, and then he started making his own films, and he made bloody good films. For the first few years of his career, he was by far and away one of the most promising directors in world cinema. He made great films like The White Balloon, The Circle, The Mirror, Crimson Gold, and Offside. I could recommend them to anyone, though they're becoming harder and harder to find. But then the Iranian authorities caught up with him. They put him under house arrest, and they banned him from making films for years. But Panahi was not going to be beaten. So he's stuck in his house, he's under house arrest. He gets his camera out and he makes a movie, just him sitting in his flat. And he had it smuggled out of the country on a USB stick. I think I read that it was in a cake or something. I don't know if that's true. But he smuggled it out of the country and it got seen at film festivals all over the world. It was called This Is Not a Film. Big joke on the Iranian authorities there. And it's actually excellent. It's really, really very good. And he's gone on doing this kind of guerrilla filmmaking ever since. I missed out on this one, Taxi Tehran. It was made in about 2015. And it's fantastic. So what he does is he's got to try and avoid these constraints against him. So he puts this little DV camera in his car. And he poses as a taxi driver. And he goes around Tehran picking up normal people from the street and talking to them. And actors that he's positioned in places around to come in at certain points so he can construct a narrative. It's a brilliant way of, getting past censorship and subverting norms. And he builds up this narrative where people start talking about there's a lot of petty crime and car theft in Tehran. And the arguments are about whether we should demonise these people or whether we should realise that they're doing it because they're poor and it's just a way of survival. And of course, Panahi is counterpointing that against what he's having to do to make a film as a filmmaker. This is the only way he can make a movie, by sort of subverting what the constraints the authorities have imposed on him. He's become like a criminal. So, form and content start to mirror each other. It's such a beautiful little example of how a filmmaker, a smart, witty filmmaker, can bypass censorship and still comment on the regime that he's suppressed by. And it's so light and airy, light on its feet. It took me back to that world of the 1990s Iranian cinema, which was so clever, while being so deceptively simple on the surface. Very good movie. Next, let's talk about l'inquiétude, or in English, anxiety. I've got a bit of anxiety. Well, it sounds better, l'inquiétude, in French, doesn't it? Now, this is actually a film by a Portuguese director called Manuel de Oliveira. Now, I'll do a little bit of introduction to Manuel de Oliveira. A Portuguese filmmaker who was actually born in the early 1900s. Fascinating man, right? He made his first film in the 1940s, Aniki Bobo. Then he didn't make another film for about 10 or 15 years. Then he didn't make another film for about another 10 years after that. And then when he got to about the age of 80, he started making a film a year. And he died. He was doing that up until about 102. He died at 107. One of the most prolific filmmakers of his era, and he was well into his 80s and 90s. Incredible man. He had an incredible life. Most of his life, actually, he wasn't a filmmaker. He ran his father's... He was born into a wealthy industrialist family, and he ran his father's factory after his father died. He was also a racing driver in his youth. I believe he was in quite a bad accident. So an incredible life this guy had. Now, once he became, a regular filmmaker, he was regarded as one of the greatest filmmakers in the world. I've always struggled with Manuel de Oliveira. I have to be honest about that. I often have found his films rather boring and rather difficult to get into. I think there's two reasons for that. The first reason is that I'm not very familiar with Portuguese history or culture, so I don't have those landmarks that allow me to orient myself in a film. I know French culture and German culture and Italian culture and their history, so I can orientate myself. Portugal, I don't know very much about, really. I feel a bit bad about that, but I don't. So I don't know the cultural landmarks that he's referring to. The second reason is because de Oliveira to me represents European high culture. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean a particularly kind of rarefied, thin air atmosphere of respectability and highbrow culture that I don't find intimidating, but I find sometimes slightly annoying and a bit cold. Let me try and explain what I mean. L'Inquiétude is a portmanteau film. It's made up of 3 stories. And the first story, it's very stage-like, deliberately so, right? And it's all set in a flat, 2 men, father and a son. They're both professors. The elderly professor decides that his son must commit suicide, right? It's a black comedy. And he must commit suicide so that he preserves his good image and his good name. You know, a bit like James Dean. James Dean died young, so retained his sort of aura, whereas Marlon Brando got old and fat, didn't he, right? So it's that kind of thing. So you see what I'm saying? It's a sort of rather droll comedy of manners, you know, like, oh, look, the older man wants to kill it, thinks his son should commit suicide. You know, it's that kind of laughter you get at the opera or at the theatre when it's not really belly laugh funny, but it's people thinking that they should show that they've got the joke, you know, and it's that kind of thing which gets on my tits. It really gets on my nerve ends. So the first part of this film is quite difficult to sit through, but it's worth it. And I want to try and explain why. You get to the second part. The second story is set in about the 1920s. It's about this writer, this airhead dreamer, and he falls for a high-class prostitute. She is a much more realistic person about the world. He's very unrealistic. He's trying to build this into being some kind of mythical romance, and it's nothing of the kind. He's disappointed in love. His friend then tells him a story, which becomes the third story of the film. And the third story of the film is a fable. And it's about a young girl in a village who's not really interested in men and the boys that she's supposed to be marrying. But she falls in with a local witch. And the witch introduces her to nature and power and magic. And she takes over the role of the witch in the village. What's happening here is something that is very rare in modern cinema. And why I like this film is it was so refreshing to find. And that is, this film is a work of art. Now that phrase is a very much abused phrase. When you watch films now, mainstream films don't even bother to try and to be artistic, most of them. And many of our art films now, they shove their artiness in your face. They're very formally rigorous, they're very slow, they're very challenging. What I mean by work of art is the old idea that a play or a novel or an epic poem works through a structure, formally, thematically, narratively, to give ideas. It's so refreshing to see that. So that what D'Oliveira does is, he deliberately starts with artifice. Then the second story, he makes it more narratively coherent. But at the same time, you have figures who are put against paintings or images to act as analogies or comments on what's happening. So it's a sort of stylized, artificial narrative. And then the final story, you go into 360-degree realism, right? So there's a formal movement. So you have to go through that very stagey, artificial bit at the beginning. Then there's a thematic movement. So the first film is about the idea of the relationship of a person to art and that relationship to immortality, right? The guy thinks his son should commit suicide to preserve his image. The second story is about a man trying to immortalise a woman he's in love with in prose. But we see that there's a disjuncture between what she really is and what the relationship really is and what he wants to write. The third story is about a woman who rejects men completely and creates her own independent self, away from the world of men in the world of nature, right? She absorbs the universe into her. So what you've got is three different discussions of the immortalizing of the self, this artificial way staying young forever, immortalizing someone in prose but it's not true, and then immortalizing yourself by becoming part of the cosmos, right? And that's done going from artifice to realism. And each film is also talking about men's relationship to women. So the first film is just about two men who completely don't care about what the women in their lives are thinking, just talking to themselves. The next one is about a man trying to relate to a woman, but he's actually just thinking about himself and his own work. In the third film, the woman rejects men entirely and goes off on her own journey. It's a work of art. And it has to move in that way to make its point. I found that so refreshing. I'm not saying it's one of the best films I've ever seen or moved me more than any other film I've ever seen, but God, it was nice, to watch. So refreshing to watch a work of art and seeing how it worked and how it was thought out and everything, every thematic and formal structure linked up. I liked that. Next up, Satyajit Ray, one of my all-time favourite directors. I must make a video about Satyajit Ray, the great Indian director, the great Bengali director at some point. There was a film of his, like Japanese cinema, I'm always chasing his films and chasing his masterpieces. And there was a film of his I've been trying to track down for years. And it's called Kanchenjungha. I think it may originally have been made for television in the early 60s. I'm not sure about this. Kanchenjungha is a mountain in the north of India near Darjeeling, which was one of the centres of the Raj, the British in India. And I've been tracking this film down. Many people have recommended it to me as a major work by Satyajit Ray, and I finally got to see it. It's a deceptively simple film. It's about an upper middle class family having a holiday in this region, and the father, who's a wealthy industrialist, is trying to marry off his daughter, but the daughter is not keen. So it's a very straightforward setup. The whole film is in the texture. We just watch these family members walking around this resort. And what Rai does is use colour and movement and the counterpoint of the different people, even the weather, the climate, with the mist rolling in and the mist rolling away, to tell his story and to give a feeling of the inner turmoil in the characters. It's a very calm, very peaceful film, but with a lot of depth, Now, the world isn't in a great state, is it? Britain itself seems to be descending into anarchy, and there's all sorts of recriminations and people blaming each other and what's really going on here. If you're interested in what's happening in the world at the moment, particularly to do with conspiracy theory and alternative ideas, shall we say, about the truth, check out a science fiction film from Poland in the 1980s that's recently been made available in the UK on Blu-ray. It's called War of the Worlds, The Next Century. Now, nominally, it was directed by Peter Zulkin. Now, nominally, it's based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. It isn't really. It also says in the credits that it's based on Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and it also tips a nod to Orson Welles, who, of course, did a famous 1930s broadcast of War of the Worlds, where he convinced people listening on the radio that Martians were actually invading the USA. Great stuff. So he tips a nod to these three people in the credits. The film itself, though, is quite different. But what he's done is, I think partly to avoid censorship in Poland, he's set it in England. So all the place names and all the characters have English names, but it's quite clearly taking the piss out of the Polish, communist regime in the early 80s. I mean, it's so obvious. The story is about a newscaster who is the face of an independent news channel. But what he discovers is that his producer and his writers are actually making up the news and giving him fake news to tell his viewers. He starts to rebel. He starts to want to try and find out what's really happening. And the story is, that aliens have come to Earth, Martians, and as soon as the Martians arrive, the state starts acting differently. It starts telling people to turn up at blood banks to give blood, the impression being that these Martians might be vampires. And they start repressing people who don't become friends with the Martians, And this newscaster decides that his life has been worthless up to this point and he wants to tell the truth. And he tries to tell the truth and create a revolution. It's well worth watching in the context of what's happening now. I don't think it's not a film you can really spoil because it's more of a thoughtful, abstract film. The ending, what happens is the Martians appear to leave. And once they've left, up to this point, the state has been saying, you must help the Martians, you must be their friend. As soon as they leave, they say, anyone who collaborated with the Martians is evil against the state, and they imprison them and start torturing them. And the subtle impression is given that the whole story of this Martian invasion may have been a creation of the state in order to allow them to more suppress and control the people. Interesting. Anyway, finally, sticking with science fiction, those of you who've been following this channel for a long time, I did a video a long time ago about 50s sci-fi movies, which I love. You know, those old B movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, etc. I finally got round to seeing the one that's eluded me for years. I could never track it down, and I've finally seen it. I Married a Monster from Outer Space. Now, I've always wanted to see this movie, and I thought it was going to be really trashy. And in a way, it is really drive-in movie, okay? So it starts off, the opening credit sequence is the Earth in space, you know, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and there's these titles, I Married a Monster from Outer Space. It's great stuff, you know. And it starts, and it's obviously directed at the teen American audience. And you've got two people snogging in a car, and then there's some lads, you know, having beer and saying, I'm not going to get married, and all this stuff. And then the main protagonist, she's going to get married to this guy. But just before they get married, he gets kidnapped at night by this strange creature. You see the monsters very early on, and the effects are brilliant. For the 50s, it's a really well-made movie, right? And he gets replaced. And when she sees him again, he's a bit cold and a bit strange. And he goes, oh my God, what's happened to you? You're not the man I married. You know, it's that kind of movie. So it's a complete rip-off of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Don Siegel. You know, it's obviously, you know, keying into that film's success, right? But, you know, it was directed by a guy called Gene Fowler Jr., and it's actually well put together. It's very enjoyable. It's a much more sophisticated piece of filmmaking than you might imagine. If there are any Doctor Who fans watching, it's well worth checking out, because if you've ever seen the story Terror of the Zygons, this film clearly, I think, had been seen by the people who put that story together. You can see it, especially in the final scenes. You'll see what I mean. There's clear references that they've used and taken. And that was quite interesting to see. But I Married a Monster from Outer Space was thoroughly entertaining. I'm not going to say it's a masterpiece of cinema, but it's a much better movie than you might think it is. And the effects are great. I thought the monsters looked really scary. And I love the sort of smoke effect where the person gets kidnapped. This sort of smoke effect goes, and then they've just disappeared. It's wonderful. So those are my favourite discoveries of the last few months. Please let me know any other films that you've seen in the last few months that really impressed you. And let me know. I'm always up for recommendations. Thanks very much.